So good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar about Nicaragua. My name is Yoav Velinevsky. I'm with the Massachusetts Peace Action and with the Latin America Solidarity Coalition of Western Mass. I want to thank MAPA, Massachusetts Peace Action, for helping with organizing this webinar, co-sponsoring it together with the Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective and Code Pink, Western Massachusetts. I believe that this is going to be the first in a series of webinars that we are going to organize, conversation that we will organize about Nicaragua. And I'm very thankful for the speakers, Jill and Chuck and Camilo, and thank you very much for Adrian, who actually helped me organizing this webinar. Adrian will be the moderator, so let me introduce Adrian. She is a medical anthropologist and professor at the American University, who has worked in Central America for many decades. She is currently serving a sentence of probation in Western Massachusetts for her part in protecting the Venezuela embassy. So she is not just like everybody else here, a member of the movement, but she's a hero of the movement. And thank you so much for your sacrifice and for the heroic stand that you took. So therefore, I will give the microphone to Adrian, who will be the moderator, introduce the speaker. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Yoav. And thank you also to Massachusetts Peace Action, Latin American Solidarity Coalition of Western Massachusetts, Code Pink of Western Massachusetts, and the Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective for hosting this webinar. I was so excited when Yoav contacted me about doing a Nicaragua webinar, because there's really so much confusion on the left about what is going on there. And that's intentional, especially with regard to the elements of that confusion that stem from US government disinformation and counterinsurgency propaganda. And that isn't to say that the situation itself isn't confusing on its own right, just to emphasize what I think that we all already know here, that whatever the situation is on the ground in any country, the United States will always put its own special imperialist and in many cases regime change spin on it. So without further ado, I just want to emphasize that after our speakers are done, we really welcome your tough questions, whatever they may be. They're tough, they can handle them. And they have just fantastic knowledge and expertise about Nicaragua. So I'll just introduce them briefly here and then go over the format of the webinar today, and then let them go. So our first speaker is Jill Clark-Gollub. She lives in the Washington, D.C. area and is from a Nicaraguan American family. Since the 2018 attempted coup in Nicaragua, Jill has been working to get the truth out about what's really happening in her country and to connect social movement activists in the US and Nicaragua, working primarily through Friends of Latin America in Maryland. In January 2020, she led a delegation to Nicaragua on behalf of that solidarity group. And I also know Jill through the Embassy Protection Collective that she was a part of when we were protecting the Venezuelan embassy. Camilo Mejia was born in Nicaragua, but moved to the US as an adolescent. Shortly after graduating high school, he joined the US military and was eventually deployed to Iraq in 2003. After 5 months in active combat, including posts in Baghdad, Al-Haditha, Al-Assad, and Al-Ramadi, he was sent home on leave, where he recognized and publicly condemned the Iraq War as criminal and immoral. He was subsequently court-martialed and charged with desertion and sent to serve 9 months of incarceration at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Camilo lives in Miami and continues to actively speak out against US imperialism. And Chuck Kaufman, my old friend, is national co-coordinator of the Alliance for Global Justice. He's been a leader of Central and Latin America solidarity movement since joining the staff of the Nicaragua Network in 1987. Chuck has been in the front ranks of the movement to support the right of people in Latin America and the Caribbean to dignity, sovereignty, and self-determination, and has led delegations to Nicaragua, Venezuela, Haiti, and Honduras. And I have had the pleasure of knowing Chuck basically since the Honduran coup in 2009. And he's such a central member of he and the Alliance for Global Justice are so key to the Honduras Solidarity Network that I work with closely. So I'm really excited to have all of you here, and to hear your wisdom about Nicaragua. Sorry. In particular, in this moment, when, as you have mentioned earlier, that the second major hurricane in as many weeks is battering Nicaragua right now as we speak, Hurricane Iota. And a fact that I just discovered before this year, only 5 hurricanes of Category 4+ strength have made a landfall in Nicaragua, and these two have been in the past 2 weeks. So Nicaragua's facing a lot of challenges, and so it couldn't be a better time to talk about it. The format of the webinar will be that each of our speakers will speak for about 12 minutes. And when their presentations are done, we will follow with questions. If you have questions in the meantime, please type them in the chat box as opposed to interrupting the presentations. But you will be able to ask your questions live following that. And we plan to finish no later than 8:15. So without further ado, I would like to ask Jill to start her presentation.
Thank you, Adrienne, and I want to thank Massachusetts Peace Action for inviting me here today, and most importantly, for covering the very important topic of Nicaragua. And I'd like to do screen share now. I don't know if the host needs to allow me to do that, but I think.
Try it, and if not, I'll make you. Okay, that's working.
Let's see. Okay, great. Okay, so Sandinismo 3.0, 2007 to 2020. There's so many accomplishments. I'm just going to rattle them off very quickly. Poverty cut in half, extreme poverty by almost 2/3. Malnutrition cut in half. This is just since 2007. Illiteracy fell from 36% to negligible levels. Only 54% of homes had electricity, now 98% do. Renewable energy went from 22% of the grid to 77%. And according to the World Economic Forum, Nicaragua is now in fifth place worldwide in gender equality. Also, maternal mortality is cut by 2/3, from about 99 per 100,000 births to about 30. Hunger went from 21% to 11% for children under 5. And it went from having the worst roads in Central America to the best, and one of the best in all of Latin America. The lowest homicide and femicide rates in Central America, and among the lowest in Latin America. The country produces 90% of the food it consumes, which means it's far on the way to food sovereignty. Access to drinking water increased from 65% of the population to over 90%. And almost 140,000 land titles have been issued to small producers since 2007. 55% of these to women, and about 30% collectively to indigenous and Afro-descendant communities on the Caribbean coast. This amounts to about 31% of the national territory. So some cross-cutting themes to notice in the many things that Chuck and I particularly are going to talk about today are that traditionally marginalized groups have been empowered: women, peasant farmers, and indigenous peoples. And also very Nicaraguan solutions are applied to things. Native seeds and ecology, using native healthcare approaches. Midwives and shamans are embraced by the Western medical system, and also mitigation of climate change. And these have yielded great strides in food sovereignty, renewable energy, and the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. So here we are, as we talked about it. Right now, Hurricane Iota is predicted to land as a Category 5 storm. And but just to tell you very briefly, the preparedness for Iota is the same as it was for Hurricane Eta. The Army and resources are using those new roads and that robust healthcare system and good COVID-19 prevention to evacuate people, to put them in shelters, to make sure that they have health services. For Hurricane Eta, only 2 Nicaraguans died who refused to evacuate and who were doing artisanal gold mining, and they fell victim to landslides. But there have been hundreds of victims in the other Central American countries who had actually more time to prepare for Hurricane Eta because it hit Nicaragua first. So here's a picture, a photograph that I just got from the Weather Channel today of people in Bilwi, also known as Puerto Cabezas, waiting to be evacuated for this storm coming now. So this leads me to talk to you a little bit about the Caribbean region of Nicaragua. The 1987 Constitution of Nicaragua designated this area here as the autonomous zones of the Atlantic coast. Now Nicaragua is embracing its Caribbean identity and calls these the Caribbean Autonomous Regions. So as you can see, it's almost half the national territory. And the Constitution says that the constitutions and laws enacted since then say that these communities have the right to develop and their social organization according to their historic and cultural contributions. The government guarantees that local communities control and benefit from their own natural resources. There's communal ownership of property. They elect their own authorities and representatives, and the autonomy guarantees preservation of native culture, languages, religions, and customs. And there's like 2 systems that go hand in hand. There's the local communal native government, which stands alongside the regional and national government. And the local communal law applies first. The national authorities only step in when invited by the local authorities. The national health system is available, but as I mentioned, it works alongside native shamans and midwives. And the public universities have been set up in the 2 autonomous regions so that there are professionals serving these communities who are from these communities. And these are just some pictures. That's some community leaders there. And these are, here you can see right there, these are the dwellings that are withstanding these Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. You can imagine how devastating that is. But here's a solar panel, which is part of the reason so many people have been able to get electricity. Another view of the communities and the people. And so now I'll talk about Nicaragua's motivation to pursue renewable energy. First of all, it has no fossil fuel deposits, but it is one of the countries most impacted by climate change. And it also has great wind, solar, and geothermal resources. This is a map of global climate risk, and you will see that Nicaragua ranks 6th in the world for vulnerability to climate change. And in fact, I think for five of these, Puerto Rico, Honduras, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Dominica are all in the Caribbean area. And I won't, this is just some of, you may have heard that Nicaragua refused to sign the 2015 climate accords. Nicaragua was saying that they didn't go far enough and insisting that the big emitters pay more. And there was under Hillary Clinton, the US got the wealthy countries to commit to contribute $100 billion in Nicaragua to the less developed countries to mitigate climate change. And Nicaragua's insisted, but this has never come through. So also food sovereignty is a major part of the improvements in life in Nicaragua. And the Nicaraguan Peasant Association, called La Asociación de Trabajadores del Campo, was one of the founding organizations of La Via Campesina, the worldwide peasant organization, which defined the term or coined the term food sovereignty, which is the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. And the laws and policies that had helped this come into being in Nicaragua are the Food and Nutritional Sovereignty and Security law enacted in 2009, one of the first of its kind in Latin America, and one of the first to actually build food sovereignty with government support. And then this has all been aided by massive distribution of land to small farmers, technical assistance, microloans, and the Hambre Cero program, really a flagship program of the Sandinismo. And this Hambre Cero, zero hunger, or bono productivo, provides pigs, cows, chickens, plants, seeds, and building materials to women in rural areas to diversify their production, improve the family diet, and strengthen women-led household economies. By 2016, this program had benefited 150,000 families, or 1 million people. And I love this quote of Orlando Nunez, who was really one of the important figures in the development of this movement and of Sandinismo. And I feel that this really captures so much of the philosophy of what the Sandinista revolution is about. The heart of the Hambre Cero program is giving capital to peasant families. A cow is capital because she reproduces. Sows, hens, and seeds reproduce. The first message is not to treat people like poor people. They are only poor because they have been impoverished. Offering poor people a glass of milk or a slice of bread is an act of charity, not revolution. The revolutionary thing about Hambre Cero in Nicaragua is that it treats people as economic actors. That is the most revolutionary message of the Sandinista revolution. And here's a picture of a woman with some of her farm animals. Beekeeping is big amongst women farmers in Nicaragua. And now 90% of the food consumed in Nicaragua is produced within the national borders, 80% of it by peasants. This includes all of the beans, corn, fruits, vegetables, honey, and dairy products, while there is sufficient surplus of beans and dairy to export. And the World Food Program says Nicaragua is one of the countries to have made the most progress in reducing hunger in the region. Another picture of a woman with her pineapple plants. And these are young people, young farmers learning about agroecological methods. They're making a compost there. And I love this slide from the Among Women Foundation, the FEM, who I was lucky enough to stay in one of their communities on my last 2 delegations to Nicaragua. And you can just take a look at this to see the difference in the philosophy of the food sovereignty movement and what the small farmers movement is like in Nicaragua. And it's having really an impact on farmers throughout the world. So for more information about food sovereignty, I highly recommend that you go to the Friends site of Friends of the ATC. That the ATC is the Asociación de Trabajadores del Campo. And also look at an article on the Council on Hemispheric Affairs website that I co-authored about food sovereignty for a lot more details. Now, just to talk very briefly about Nicaragua's response to COVID-19, the country really began preparing for this emergency since it came back in, the Sandinistas came back into office in 2007, building 18 new hospitals and making healthcare free of charge. And Nicaragua bucked the international trend of severe lockdowns and began to form a task force and sent health brigades to tell the community about the virus, and had the last count I heard, there 5 million house-to-house visits had been made by health brigades. They continue to do vaccination and to offer services that have been so neglected in other countries that have been overwhelmed by COVID-19. And just, I know my time is running out, so maybe I'll close with this slide and we can come back to other information if we have time. But Nicaragua has the 4th lowest fatality rate per capita in Latin America from COVID-19. So it's 2.4 per million population. In the US, that's 76.14. The hospitals were not overwhelmed. The economy is not in severe crisis. In fact, exports have grown. The country has not become heavily indebted like its Central American neighbors, and there is no food shortage, although this second hurricane does threaten Nicaragua's food security. So I will stop there and let Camilo speak. Let me stop screen share. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Jill. You really made it through a large number of slides in a very short, in under 12 minutes. I'm impressed. Thank you so much. That was great information. So yes, oh, and there goes my alarm. So Camilo, we're looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Adrienne. And thank you also, like Jill said, to the Peace Action of Massachusetts. This is not the first time working together. We've collaborated in the past, not the office in Massachusetts, but certainly others. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be back here. Many of the things that Jill mentioned, I had no idea about. I did know many of the things that she was talking about on a broader scale, perhaps. But before I address that, I want to share with you that when I came home from the Iraq War and refused to go back to Iraq on conscientious objector grounds, Amnesty International did adopt me as a prisoner of conscience and launched a campaign to secure my freedom and my safety while I was incarcerated. And ever since I got out of, well, not even since I got out of jail, but while I was in prison, because of that campaign, I received tens of thousands of letters from all over the world, from people who, through Amnesty, had heard about what was happening in Iraq because of my my testimony and my refusal to go back to the war. And so upon my release from prison, I was able to establish a very close working relationship with Amnesty. And whenever I would go do a book reading, because I wrote a book about my experience in the war, I would team up with local chapters of Amnesty and do events with Amnesty and collaborate in some major international events as well. So I had a pretty close working relationship, and I was very grateful to Amnesty for many, many years because of that. So fast forward now to April of 2018, when we basically see what is reported as a popular uprising against the Sandinista government based on manipulated information on reforms to the retirement system. My initial reaction, as I mentioned before, because I didn't really know the details of all the accomplishments of the Sandinista government, was one of support of the mostly the peasants who were traveling to the city to partake in what I believe to be peaceful protest. But I remained a Sandinista at heart and merely supported what I believe something to be a matter of principle, which is the people's right to protest. But when I began to hear reports that the Sandinista government was massacring students and that they were highly corrupt, and that they had engaged in a rampage of basically killing protesters, who were peaceful. I could not believe that, and so I began to pay more attention to the news that was coming from Nicaragua. And I remember some of the news reports that I had seen coming from Syria, when the basically like the corporate hegemonic global media was making a case that President Bashar al-Assad was bombing schools, and that they were using chemical weapons against civilian populations. And from a merely military perspective, that didn't really make any sense, because you would see like this white helmets, show up in sandals, without any protective gear to respond to sarin gas attacks and things like that. And so I realized that there was something really, really wrong with with these reports of use of chemical weapons, and like how basically like the whole machinery of propaganda of the U.S. have been set in motion to create this state of terror. And when I started looking into the information that was coming about Nicaragua, through CNN and some human rights organizations, it reminded me of what I had seen in Syria. It reminded me like out of the scenes that I had seen that had been basically fabricated, and a lot of the things that people were saying were very scripted, and it didn't really make any sense, having been to war and combat. And finding somebody who's like in the middle of a massacre to be so well spoken and speak such perfect English, and basically address the international community and human rights organizations rather than, cry and basically tend to the dead or the wounded. So I began to pay even more attention to the claims, and I began to do my own research. And I realized that a lot of the things that they were saying didn't make any sense, because they did not really stand to scrutiny when you look at a lot of the things that Jill just mentioned, that you have a government that had basically devoted all of these resources to helping the people. And when I saw a report that Amnesty International had written, I became infuriated, because the first thing that happened to me is I was in absolute disbelief. So I basically took the report and went claim by claim to try to corroborate what they were saying. And what I found was that the information that they were using was coming from human rights organizations and civil society organizations and corporate private media that have been fully financed by the United States. In particular, they were getting funding from the USA, U.S. Agency for International Development, and the National Endowment for Democracy, which, by the way, founded and provided the initial funding for one of the main human rights organizations that was providing all the reports about the death and the massacres and things like that, which was an organization that President Reagan basically funded and founded in Costa Rica with net money to whitewash Contra atrocities back in 1983. And this was the main source, or one of three main sources of information that organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights were using. So I wrote an open letter to Amnesty to protest the role that they were playing in the destabilizing of my country, to which they took a long time to respond, and might have well just sent a pamphlet. Basically, did not really address any of the issues that I brought up.
All right.
And so I want to bring that up because one of the strengths that this regime change operations have is credibility. They have a lot of credibility because they use a lot of these organizations that have a lot of prestige, like Amnesty International, and that work alongside governments and global entities like the UN or the Organization of American States. But this is basically the role that they're playing, is that they are helping destabilize countries that have been marked for regime change for whatever reason by the US government. And so the instrumentalizing of human rights organizations has not ended. It has not ended with Amnesty International. It has continued. And it is part of a campaign basically to bring down the Sandinista government, in my opinion, in part because of all the things that Jill said. Nicaragua, you have to remember, is considered the second poorest country in the American hemisphere, and yet is able to respond to the COVID pandemic in a way that hardly anybody else in the region is able to do, to provide healthcare for all its citizens, to provide education, primary, secondary, and university education free of charge to all of its citizens, and to basically provide an alternative model to neoliberal models. And it's a bad example for a country that wants to impose neoliberal policies upon the entire world. And so we are finding ourselves in the continuation of this campaign through, Jill mentioned COVID-19, and the excellent response by the government has actually been used to basically criticize Nicaragua because we did not go into a full lockdown, which would have spelled chaos and extreme hunger and death for us because we have an informal economy. They have, of course, passed the NICA Act, which is amounts to almost a blockade, an economic blockade. And in addition to that, they have continued to sanction key members of the Nicaraguan government in order to make it increasingly difficult for Nicaragua to receive aid, including aid to face the COVID-19 crisis. The last thing I want to talk about in my last 2 minutes, it's this program called the Responsive Assistance in Nicaragua Plan, which was leaked by the US Embassy not very long ago. I want to say maybe a couple months ago. And it's basically a blueprint of the United States' intention to continue to destabilize the country. And it basically learned from the first time around when the Sandinistas lost the election back in 1990, but were able to hold on to its popular base and popular support, and were able to implement a lot of changes even before being able to win the elections. Basically, we called it ruling from the bottom through people and popular struggle. So having realized that the United States government is no longer happy to merely deliver a defeat at the polls, but they want to ensure that there's a complete destruction of Sandinismo as a political, social, and historic force in the country. So they have 5 main steps. They are not necessarily going to be applied in that order, but they basically are a nonviolent action to foment unrest, social and political struggle, or heating up the streets, such as what they did, with the reforms to the retirement system, social and political struggle. Freedom of the press and human rights. So this idea that there's persecution of reporters and there's this gross violations of human rights in Nicaragua, psychological war, which we have seen a lot of in Nicaragua through a campaign of fear and violence that gets reported as peaceful nonviolent protest, and street protests to demand that President Ortega steps down. They envision 3 scenarios. The first scenario is a peaceful transition, thinking that the Nicaraguan people would vote the opposition into power, the presidency, which is highly unlikely given the latest polls and the fact that nobody wants more unrest in Nicaragua, and then also that the opposition is they're fighting against each other. The second scenario is sudden transition brought about by a natural disaster or a popular uprising, or a health crisis such as COVID, that could create such unrest that it will bring about the overthrow of the government. Or number 3, which is the most likely to happen, is a delayed transition, taking into account the popular support that the Sandinista government has, and assuming that they're going to win the election, that they're going to engage in a long-term Gene Sharp style regime change operation until they bring down Sandinismo, not just the government, but also the idea of Sandinismo, the programs of Sandinismo, similar to what happened in Bolivia after the coup against Evo Morales, when they basically launched a campaign to undo all of the wins of that particular government movement towards socialism. I'm going to leave it at that. I know it's a lot of information. I'm going to share a link to the book that we put together, actually several of us who are here, and as well as a prequel to that book where you can find all the information that I just shared with you. So you don't have to worry about any references. But I'll leave it at that, and I'll be happy to answer questions after Chuck speaks.
Okay, thanks. And thank you for having me. My task is to cover some of the things Joe and Camila did not get to, and to talk a bit about solidarity. I'm in my 34th year on the national staff of the Alliance for Global Justice and its founding organization.
Can't hear you. Chuck, I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Okay, hold on a second.
I can hear him.
I can hear you too.
We can hear you. We can
I hear you fine.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. So I'm in my 34th year on the national staff of the Alliance for Global Justice and its founder, the Nicaraguan Network. When I joined the Nicaragua Network in 1987, we had 300 local committees in 46 states, and overthrowing the Sandinista government was one of the top US foreign policy priorities. So a lot's changed since then, but one thing that has never changed is the US goal to control Nicaragua. Why that is so important is that Nicaragua is the threat of a good example. Nicaragua is the second poorest country after Haiti in the hemisphere. How can it provide free healthcare and education to its citizens? How can it have extended electricity to all but a handful of the most isolated communities? How did it become the first country other than Cuba in the hemisphere to achieve the UN millennial goals to cut poverty in half by 2015? How did it cut infant and maternal mortality to the level we enjoy in rich nations? How did it achieve the lowest or the fourth lowest COVID-19 mortality rate in the Americas? It achieved those things and more, as Jill has mentioned, because it had a government with a will to do so. It had a government that has what liberation theology describes as a preferential option for the poor. And this is intolerable to the US empire. Granted that Nicaragua is no longer in the top tier of US foreign policy objectives, but the State Department's a large agency and is capable of keeping a lot of balls in the air at the same time. Camilo talked about US intervention and about the RAIN document that was leaked showing the US plan for destabilizing Nicaragua through next year's presidential election. Well, you can be sure that there have been a RAIN document for every one of the 41 years since the triumph of the Sandinista Revolution. A RAIN document or its equivalent back in the days that the US preferred method of regime change was through direct violence, as demonstrated by the Contra War. Through Reagan, Bush, Clinton, the other Bush, Obama, and Trump, those policies have never changed, and they're not going to change under Biden either. That's why we, as anti-imperialist solidarity activists, need to continue to defend Nicaragua. 40,000 Nicaraguans died to free their country of the US-imposed Somoza dictatorship. Another 40,000 died to defend that freedom during the US-imposed Contra War. Additional tens of thousands died from US-imposed neoliberal austerity measures that caused malnutrition, infant and maternal mortality, and death from preventable diseases during the 17 years of neoliberal governments from 1990 until Daniel Ortega was elected president again in 2006. That's a lot of blood on our hands. Yes, my hands and your hands. We have a moral obligation to expose and oppose US intervention in Nicaragua's sovereign affairs and to stand on the side of Nicaraguans determining their own destiny and solving their own internal differences, free from US efforts to manipulate their political system and create misery. Yes, there are countries at greater threat of US intervention right now: Venezuela, Syria, Bolivia, and Iran, to name a few. But the blood of Nicaraguan martyrs stains our hands, and we have a moral obligation to continue to walk in solidarity with them. Especially since the failed coup of 2018 in the US, we hear hardly anything except how bad the government of Nicaragua is and that it is committing atrocities. We heard these same stories in the 1980s. I remember coming back from a 3-week coffee picking brigade in Nicaragua in 1987 and being shocked at the media coverage of events that took place while I was there. They were lies then, they're lies now. Unless we understand that basic fact, we can't understand anything about US-Nicaragua relations. The Nicaraguan people aren't confused. Recent polls give Daniel Ortega and the Sandinista Party 50.7 to 69% advantage over the combined opposition, which ranged from 7.9% to 31%. And to make matters worse for US objectives, there's no such thing as a combined opposition. To the despair of successive US ambassadors, the Nicaragua opposition is led by thieves and knaves who care only about feathering their own nest. They have no political or economic program, and the majority of Nicaraguans know it and still remember the economic suffering prior to the 2007 return to government of the Sandinistas. 60.9% of the people in an end of October M&R Consultants poll said Nicaragua were off with the Sandinistas. Only 12.1% said that the opposition, and the rest said neither or they didn't know. M&R Consultants was the only national or international polling company to predict the Sandinista electoral loss in 1990. Over the long term, President Ortega has ranked among the most popular 3 or 4 presidents in Latin America in a broad range of opinion polls. You would never guess these truths from what little coverage of Nicaragua there is in the US. There's not a lot that solidarity activists can do for Nicaragua these days. We have no friends in Congress, and Nicaragua is almost out of the media. But what coverage there is, it's composed of lies and disinformation, just as it has been since 1979. We can at least keep ourselves informed from reliable sources. The Alliance for Global Justice publishes a weekly blog called Nica Notes that contains an article and news briefs in English. It's one of the only sources of English language news from an anti-imperialist perspective. You can subscribe to it online at afgj.org/sign up. In 2018, when the attempted coup roiled Nicaragua for 3 months, we and our sister solidarity group in the UK and US and UK immigrants to Nicaragua, along with some Nicaraguans, formed a clandestine group to put out a counter narrative to the lies and the doctored videos that made it look like the government and police had run amok. We were clandestine because some of the people in Nicaragua's lives were at risk due to their participation. One of our group had a roadblock in front of his house, and he could hear them at times discussing whether to burn down his house. Our group has stayed together since 2018 and even added some people since that grim time. We've published 2 electronic books, Nicaragua Live, Uprising or Coup, and The Revolution Will Not Be Stopped, which Camila just mentioned. Those came out just a few months ago. We also have published authoritative rebuttals of Amnesty International reports that relied only on opposition lies with no real investigation, and other articles to set the record straight. You can find many of these in archived Nika notes or for download at afgj.org. The website tortillaconsal.com is another great source of information. I think that's it for now. The best rule of thumb is that if it doesn't sound right, it probably isn't, and you can probably find the truth from one of the sources I've mentioned. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chuck. And thank you, Jill and Camilo as well for your fantastic presentations. At this point, we can open it up to questions. There have been a few mentioned in the chat, so I can read those, or if folks want to jump in, they can do that in the meantime while I go back to them.
I know time's short. Could I say something, Adrian?
Sure.
Ms. Jill, I see that Ken Brosiner, I'm not sure I pronounced that right, is saying he wants to know if the speakers are going to deny that Ortega and his wife, vice president, are both corrupt and repressive. And if I may screen share again, I'd just like to show you, you know, you don't get infrastructure like this. This is the road being built from Managua to the Atlantic coast, which is connecting communities that never had access to markets and hospitals and schools before. You don't get that from a corrupt government. Those who know something about Honduras know that all kinds of aid comes and it makes politicians richer in those countries, and that you don't see this kind of infrastructure built up. You don't see this kind of improvement in healthcare. Here, these are some roads in Managua. People who haven't been to Managua in 12 or 15 years wouldn't recognize it now. I mean, look at this. Like I said, some of the best roads in all of Latin America, but one of the poorest countries. And then I'd like to go back to a slide I didn't have time to show you, which is, well, here's one about crime and corruption, one of the lowest, rates of violence, and recognition by all these organizations, international organizations, the IMF, World Bank, IDB, Central American Bank, ECLAC, SIECA. They're recognizing Nicaragua for responsibility, transparency, excellent project execution, investments in health and good management of COVID-19, excellent services to the population, and investments in infrastructure. And then this one I feel is very telling. This is a DEA
your
map.
slides are not changing.
Oh, can you see the slide of the map of Central and South America?
No, we
No,
see a
it's
truck
been
on the
on the
road.
highway.
Okay, let's see. Let me see if I stop share and then go back to screen share. Can you see this slideshow now?
No.
Oh, darn it. Can you see this? Crime and corruption?
No, nothing's
No,
being
darn
shared.
it.
We're seeing you.
Well,
You need to share now. Maybe share the screen and change the
window.
okay. Can you see this now?
Yeah, now we see
Okay, sorry
map.
about that. Oh, I was showing, I won't go back to the photos of this elaborate highway system, in the country. But this is a DEA map of drug routes. Look at Nicaragua. They all go around Nicaragua. It looks like something's touching there. One thing is touching there. But this is, when you talk about corruption, look at where the drugs are going, follow the drug money. And that's what I have to say in response to that question. And also, I just want to mention, because I suggest that Joav and Adrian share resources with all the registrants afterwards instead of taking more time during the webinar. There are lots of good resources we could send you by email, but there is something that's time sensitive this Wednesday. Code Pink, along with Alliance for Global Justice, Friends of Latin America, and I'm sure I'm leaving out other organizations, are co-sponsoring Code Pink's weekly program. And this week it is going to have a comparison of climate change adaptation and hurricane response in Nicaragua and Honduras. The guests are Paul Oquist from Nicaragua and Gerardo Torres. So, and then there's also a Sanctions Kill delegation to Nicaragua in February. So please look for those resources. I hope they can be sent to you soon. Thank you.
Great, and I can actually share, thank you so much, Jill, and I can actually share the Sanctions Kill delegation flyer in just a moment. Sorry, I've got too many windows open, so I will share that momentarily. All right. So there's a question here from Peter Schutz. What can we do or tell our congressional representatives to help them see the light on Nicaragua? So does anybody have something to say about that? And then I will re-up the next couple questions as well.
Adrian, I would say that this is a good start for people to become informed and not only rely on the very same corporate media that have historically demonized countries that oppose US policies. I would say also use history, because a lot of the things that are happening in Nicaragua are just history repeating itself. Look at the macro, as Jill has said, claims of corruption and massacres don't add up when you look at all the things that the government has done for the people, when you look at mortality rates, when you look at education, when you look at healthcare. None of that stuff makes sense. Also, study regime change, because the application of tactics and strategies is very similar. If you look at what's happened in the Ukraine, for instance, if you look at there are various different kinds of regime change operations, like the one that they did to Dilma in Brazil, more forceful ones like the one against Zelaya back in 2009 by the Obama-Biden administration. And you'll realize that basically what's happening, it's an almost to the T application of regime change via Gene Sharp. And it's basically like some of the same steps that I talked about with RAIN are some of the same steps that are being applied in other parts of the the hemisphere, some of the same organizations. In the case of Nicaragua, you can go to WikiLeaks and you can look at the embassy cables, and you can cross-reference a lot of the leaders of the opposition and see that they have met with US officials at the US Embassy. They have met with USAID representatives. They have met with NET representatives. So if you actually go out there and look for the information yourselves, you're going to, it's not even like well hidden. It's in plain sight. And so that would be one start. The other thing is use the resources that we're providing you with. I put the websites that Chuck talked about, AFGJ, Tortilla con Sal. I'll put them on the chat again. But they're full of information, and you can actually go to the sources, that like I did with the Amnesty report. Some of the sources that they cited actually contradicted their own reports. So use that and create your own narrative as you address your representatives, your senators, rather than just repeating what we're saying. I always, when I talk about Nicaragua, I always tell people, don't believe me. Don't believe a word I say. Just pay attention and then do your own research and start learning for yourselves and start looking for the sources of information yourselves.
Could I add something on, Adrian?
Of course.
It's hard on Nicaragua just alone to have any kind of congressional strategy, because there isn't going to be any legislation that's coming before Congress that is Nicaragua only. But we do have some other angles of attack, and particularly at the moment is sanctions. There's a coalition called Sanctions Kill, which I would recommend that Peace Action join, that is addressing sanctions as another form of war. In Venezuela, we're seeing AFGJ has a program called Manito's Children's Fund, in which we're buying beans from Nicaraguan ATC farmers and ship to Venezuela for children's nutrition. And we can't get the beans to Venezuela because of the blockade. We can't find a shipper who will ship them because of the sanctions against Venezuela. We're not sure of having the diesel fuel to pick up the seeds or the beans at the port and delivering them to the farmers and to the feeding centers. So sanctions is something that is killing people all around the world, just like war, and it is something that we can address with Congress.
Great, thank you so much, Chuck. And speaking of Sanctions Kill, that's actually one of the organizations that is sponsoring the trip that the delegation that is going to Nicaragua shortly, that Terry from COPINC is leading in February. I've been trying to add the PDF to the link, but it's not letting me. So I will make sure that Yoav can send that out, or I will share that with Yoav so that he can send that out to folks who have registered for this call. I think that, you know, another important thing to note is that whatever criticisms there may be of the Ortega government, whether they're legitimate or not, that doesn't negate the fact that U.S. is, you know, that I think our primary position, at least for me, as a person, as a U.S. citizen, my primary obligation is to ensure that the United States is not interfering in the sovereign affairs of other countries. And that is why I took a stand in Venezuela as well, not in support of the Maduro government, but rather in opposition, in steadfast opposition to US-led regime change efforts, which I have seen firsthand, you know, over the course of the past 11 years, the devastating impact that has had in Honduras, you know, which obviously, you know, you've mentioned the statistics on COVID, on healthcare, on infrastructure, on you know, agriculture in Nicaragua. Honduras just can't hold a candle to that, and that's precisely because of United States military occupation and regime change efforts. I think it's really important to always emphasize that. There was a question from my beloved co-defendant David Paul that earlier on that I want to bring up. His question was, can anyone address the reports by PBS and Oakland Institute about the Nicaraguan government ignoring or being complicit in what they say are violent land grabs of indigenous lands by cattle and beef companies, and if there is evidence to refute that can be used. Does anybody have, Chuck?
I could take a start at it. This is a case of conflating two different things. In Nicaragua, for Nicaragua to be able to export beef to the United States, there's protocols that allow the tracking of, that require the tracking of each animal. So we know, and US companies that are buying the beef know where those animals are coming from. It's economically not feasible to ship beef on the hoof from the Caribbean coast to the Pacific coast for shipping to the United States. So that part of it, of the story, is just false. And it's got nothing to do with the land conflicts on the Caribbean side of the country. Those land conflicts on the Caribbean side of the country have been going on forever. The way that the Somoza and his cronies would expand their land holdings was that they would drive the peasants off the land that they had been farming, take over that land. The peasants would move into the rainforest, cut the trees, farm that land for a while. And then the Somocistas would drive them further into the agricultural frontier. In 1999, I went to Bluefields in the southern part, and the Rama Indians told us that they could hear the chainsaws from their villages. And when we flew over the rainforest, you know, it was hollowed out. There were just squares of land that were clear cut there. It's a terrible problem. And I personally think the government should exert more resources into stopping the movement of the agricultural frontier. But most of those people who are going on to indigenous owned cooperative land and taking it over are poor peasant families themselves. And the fault is in the corrupt lawyers and judges and in many cases, Mosquito Indian leaders who are selling land illegally there. So there's no doubt that there's a problem. It's not the problem that the Oakland Institute and PBS identified, and cutting off Nicaragua's ability to export beef to the United States would not solve the problem. It would just hurt Nicaraguan farmers.
Thank you so much, Chuck. I'm looking, we've got 7 minutes left by my count. So I'm looking at, so there's a question that it looks like Camilo has already answered from Jerry about whether sanctions are being used. And yes, I mean, sanctions are being implemented against Nicaragua. And so it looks like Camilo addressed that briefly, just looking to see. Sorry, my apologies. So there's a question from Michael. Is there still a plan to create a canal from the Pacific to the Caribbean? And then a separate question, I'll read these two together, from David Summersby. Would it not be helpful to the future of Nicaragua if there was another leader other than Ortega? I think the optics alone of Ortega leaving power would benefit Nicaragua's path towards future independence and autonomy. So does anybody want to respond to those two? And I apologize to anybody who I've skipped over here. I'm going to try to get back to them.
I'll be happy to start if Jill or Chuck don't want to.
Go ahead.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Well, last I heard, yes, the canal is still happening, not as planned, as previously planned. I think part of it is going to be a dry canal, which is going to be cheaper and it's going to cost less of an environmental impact. I don't know if there are any details that have been published since President Ortega said that the canal was still happening. I believe he said that last year. And so that's for the first question. For the second question, I think the real question is, who do Nicaraguans want to be their president? And there have been legal observers in elections in Nicaragua ever since the Frente Sandinista got back to power, and even hostile entities like the Organization of American States have said that the will of the people has been reflected by the popular vote and the results of the election. So maybe to a Western audience, you know, the fact that Ortega is still in power is looked down upon. This is a question for the Nicaraguan people and the Nicaraguan people alone to answer. And for as long as the Nicaraguan people continue to elect Daniel Ortega, and for good reason, in my opinion, I will support the government of Daniel Ortega. That's my answer to that. I don't know if Jill or Chuck want to add to that.
I think that was an excellent answer, Camilo. But just to add to that, I would say that in our delegation in January, one of our speakers who spoke to us, who's a local official in Masaya, and someone from the indigenous neighborhood of Monimbo. And I have to say that I think we reflected a little bit of Western developed country bias, thinking that Daniel Ortega shouldn't run. You know, we support Nicaragua and the revolution, but they need to have a different person leading the revolution or the government. And we asked her, do you think Danielle will be the candidate in, you know, the next elections? And she said, I hope so. And that really led us to reflect on what Camilo just said. And we heard a lot of support amongst Nicaraguans for their government, and even some who have criticisms of Danielle want to be under the leadership of the FSLN, and the FSLN will determine who is the representative. And a lot of people are very happy with the way things are going in Nicaragua and very upset by the violence caused by what some of the peasant women told me, this crazy small splinter groups of opposition groups who wouldn't be there if they weren't funded for the US by the US. So that just adds to a gringa perspective on what Camilo just told you.
If I could add as well, Angela Merkel has been the head of Germany for longer than Danielle has been head of Nicaragua, and I have never heard anybody say in the US that she should give up her position and be replaced. So I think we need to look at our own internalized imperialism and racism when we raise issues like that. It's not our business who Nicaraguans want to be their president. It's their business. I would take the same position on the canal. It's not our business. We cut down all of our forests from Pittsburgh to Chicago and changed the climate of the entire Midwest 100+ years ago. We don't have any moral standing to tell another country how it can develop. I don't personally think the canal will ever be built. The international financing just isn't there. The engineering is too difficult. But if it is, it's not my business.
And yeah, thank you, all of you, for those answers. And I mean, I think that I might even differ from the three of you on that. Just my perspective, I don't personally like Ortega that much, but where I agree is 100% that it's none of our business. I think if we're going to be, or none of our business as gringos, right? I mean, if we are going to be consistent with the perspective that we should not be interfering in foreign countries' sovereign affairs, then we need to let those countries be deciding that. And so I want to ask, I think there was a really good question from Sunny. which was what are the priorities of Nicaragua going forward, and what else are they working on? So if we could just briefly end with that, and then we're going to be out of time.
Well, I mean, I think it's the same priorities that it's been since 2007, recuperating the social and economic rights that were lost during the 17 years of neoliberal governments, increasing economic fairness, and helping people to raise themselves out of poverty. Those are, and surviving climate change. I think those are the main priorities. Somebody else may want to add to that.
I agree. I think in light of the highly contested election of the United States, things remain the same for Nicaraguans. We know that no matter who wins this election, whether it's Biden or Trump or someone else, we're going to continue to fight for independence, our freedom, and our sovereignty. So we're going to continue working on the same programs that we have talked about here, continue to work on and strengthen our food sovereignty, our education system, our healthcare system. We've never stopped, even during the darkest times of the attempted coup, during hurricanes. You know, this is when we become stronger as a nation, and we're going to continue working on that. There's going to be no deviation from the revolutionary plan of the Frente Sandinista.
Thank you. Any last words, Jill?
Oh, just the priorities are the big challenges that we've mentioned. Climate change is a really big one, and all these social and economic rights that Camilo mentioned. And I would also say that peace and reconciliation, that is another big theme of Sandinismo. And I mentioned in the chat, people, I don't know how many read it, that Nicaragua was pressured into issuing an amnesty last year. And there was over 100 people, I believe, who had been imprisoned. They had been convicted of violence during the coup attempt of 2018, many of them because they had documented the acts of torture and things that they had done and shared them on social media, and they had them on their cell phones. So these are people who were real criminals, but there was an amnesty and an effort to bring about peace and reconciliation, which has been a theme ever since the Sandinistas first came into office in 1979. So peace amongst the Nicaraguan people is another priority.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much to all of you. You've just had such fantastic information, and I've learned a lot from this. I do want to remind everybody that as we are speaking, Hurricane Iota is really ravaging Nicaragua and Honduras. I know that the Alliance for Global Justice is fundraising right now for both countries, and all of those funds will really go directly to the hurricane aid where it's most needed. So please take a look there. And I don't know, Yoav, if you have any last comments?
I just want to thank you for a very informative, very interesting discussion, presentations. I want to thank everybody who participated, and we'll stay in touch. We'll send you information, and we will invite you for the next webinar that we'll organize on Nicaragua, as well as other countries. So thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.